She was starving alone on an alien world, until a human hunter found her too late. The cryotube opened with a sound like a body hitting water. Maren Voss folded forward out of the sleeve, bronchial fluid running from her nose and the corners of her mouth, knees hitting the cold deck hard enough to bruise. She stayed there a moment on all fours, head hanging, the blood that had pooled in her sinuses draining down her throat in a warm copper slide. Around her, 7 other tubes hissed open in sequence. She heard the wet sounds of the others waking up and did not look. There was something private about the first seconds out of cryo, something animal. She straightened, pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. The readout above her bunk said Vereka Station, Drift 7, Outer Perimeter. Transit time, 11 months, 4 days. Current local cycle, 317. She had not seen her brother in 14 months, and she was standing in her underwear in a docking ring on the edge of inhabited space. And her legs were not yet working properly, and somewhere in the bunk above hers, Private Arlen Soot was making sounds that a person should only make privately in a bathroom. Maren Voss pulled on her fatigues and got to work. Vereka Station was a relay post technically. That was the word IGDEF used, a relay post. What it was in practice was a pressurized box the size of a city block, bolted to a rock the Djurkalith had apparently decided was sacred, and staffed by 11 humans whose job was to sit inside the box and not touch the rock and file reports no one at Central Command would read for 6 months anyway. She had been here 9 weeks before the first Djurkalith came to the perimeter wire. It was not like the briefing images. The briefing images showed creatures roughly bipedal, roughly the height of a tall human, with what the xenolinguistics team at Herschel had called, with academic confidence, a bilateral symmetry consistent with social cognition. What stood at the wire that morning was something closer to a building that had decided to be alive. Maren estimated 4 meters at the shoulder. The outer carapace was the mottled gray-green of exposed nerve. The thing had 6 limbs that she could count, and a cluster of sensory organs where a face might have been, and it stood at the wire for 11 minutes without moving while she watched it from the observation post, hand loose on the grip of her rifle, breathing through her nose. It left, it did not touch the wire. She filed the report. Command acknowledged 11 weeks later. The second time a Djurkalith came to the wire, there were 3 of them, and they came at night. Maren's mother had been a hunter, not a soldier, a hunter. There was a difference, her mother had explained once, when Maren was 8 and standing at the edge of a birch forest in Finland with snow filling her boots and the first clean rifle she had ever been allowed to hold pressed into her shoulder. A soldier does what the institution requires, her mother had said. A hunter does what the animal requires. You have to get outside yourself. Think about what the other creature wants, where it's going, what it fears. Then you get there first. Her mother had been very good at it. Her mother had also eventually joined the institution, and then the institution had killed her, but Maren still thought about the birch forest, about getting there first. She thought about it at 200, when the motion sensors on the west perimeter began going off in a cascade. Soot was already up, pulling on his boots. He was young, 19. From a place in Georgia that had mostly soybeans and one barbecue restaurant he talked about with the religious intensity of a man whose god was smoked meat. He had 6 months of training and soft eyes and an easy smile that Maren found she was increasingly reluctant to see dimmed by anything. She put her hand on his arm before he could grab his rifle. "They come in 3s, she said. "Something went wrong, they came in 12s. He looked at her. In the green light of the instrument panels, his face was very young. "How many sensors?" "All of them." The Djurkalith did not fight the way the briefing said they would. The briefing, authored by personnel who had never been west of Callisto, said the Djurkalith were a cautious species, hierarchical, with a preference for overwhelming force deployed after extended observation. They would watch. They would assess. They would engage only when they had achieved what the briefing called a resource certainty threshold. What the briefing did not account for was what happened when the resource in question was the rock. The west wall came in at 214. Not a breach, not an entry point. The entire wall, 8 centimeters of reinforced composite, folded inward in one piece, as if something on the other side had simply decided the wall no longer needed to exist. Maren was halfway down the corridor when it happened, and the pressure change hit her like a slap. And then the lights went out, and then there was a sound she had no referent for, a sound that she later could only describe as what it might sound like if a cathedral were being digested. She found Soot in the dark by his voice. He was swearing in a focused, methodical way that she would have laughed at under any other circumstances. She found his arm and pulled him into the equipment locker and shut the door. They crouched behind a shelf of oxygen canisters. Through the locker slats she could see the corridor and the red emergency lighting, and she could see the shape moving down it, and she kept her hand over Soot's mouth and felt him go very still. The geocaliph that moved through the corridor was smaller than the ones at the wire, maybe 3 meters. It moved with its 6 limbs in a rolling articulation that was almost graceful, sensory cluster rotating slowly, touching the walls on either side with the tips of 2 limbs as if reading something written there. It passed the locker without stopping. Maren took her hand away from Soot's mouth. "There's a soldier inside of you," she said quietly, for no real reason except that her mother's voice had been speaking in her head since the wall came in. "You're going to need to find it right now." Soot wiped his mouth. "I'm going to need a rifle. I know where they are." There were survivors, fewer than she hoped. Lieutenant Carraway was in the medical bay with a shattered collarbone, propped against the wall with a sidearm across his knees. And when Maren came through the door, he raised the weapon and then lowered it and let out a breath that seemed to take most of him with it. Specialist Fenn was alive. She had locked herself in the server room and was currently doing something to the station's long-range broadcast array that Maren lacked the technical vocabulary to fully understand. Cadets Rosso and Park were alive. They were both 19, both bleeding from places that were not immediately lethal. Both looking at her with the specific expression of people who had just understood with their whole bodies that the distance between alive and not was a distance you could cross in a single step. Private Chen was not. She did not let herself stop at that. The hunter her mother had taught her to be did not stop. "Array," she said to Fenn, "are you getting anything out?" Fenn's hands kept moving over the panel. "Maybe. Interference is bad. Signal might be bouncing off the rock formation to the west, which would scatter it. Best I can tell, I'm broadcasting a carrier wave on IGDEF standard emergency frequencies, but I don't know if it's reaching anybody, and I don't know if anybody's close enough to care." "Keep going." "I know. How long do you think we have?" Fenn's hand stopped. She turned around. She had blood on her forehead from a cut above her hairline, and she looked at Maren with dark, careful eyes. "I think they're clearing the station systematically. Outer sections first. They're moving inward." A pause. "Maybe 3 hours, maybe 2. "Then we have 2, Maren said. She found the poem that had been stenciled above her bunk on her first day at Verica. Someone had put it there years ago, some prior occupant, and the paint had faded to a suggestion of itself, but she had read it often enough that she knew it without looking. She couldn't remember the author. Something about a sailor, about forward motion, about the promise implicit in dawn, not because dawn was safe, but because dawn was definitive. You could face what you could see. She had thought it was sentimental when she first read it. She thought of it now, crouched in the maintenance crawl between sections 4 and 5, listening to the sound of the geocaliph moving through the rooms above her, and thought maybe sentiment was not the word she had been looking for. Maybe the word was accurate. Soot was behind her in the crawl. He had stopped swearing. That was either very good or very bad. "There's a thing I don't understand," he said quietly. "One thing. Why the rock?" She pulled herself forward on her elbows. Ahead, the crawl intersected a vertical shaft with a ladder. Above them was the junction station's environmental control. If she could reach the controls, she could do something useful with the internal atmosphere. Not much, but something. I read the cultural assessments from Herschel. The Djur-Kalith are a stone-worshipping species, not metaphorically, literally. Certain rock formations have the same legal status under their religious law as a living person. The surveying team 3 years ago may have done something to the rock formation without knowing what it was. So they're here because we desecrated their church. Or we're squatting on their ancestors' grave. The Xeno team wasn't entirely sure. The report language was, and I am quoting directly, culturally nuanced. Soot was quiet for a moment. That's a terrible reason to die. Most reasons are. She reached the ladder and started climbing. The thing Marin had learned about fear, through her mother and through the years since, was that it had a texture. Raw fear was smooth and fast, and it moved you without asking your permission, your body making decisions that your brain would ratify later or wouldn't, depending on whether you were still around to do the ratifying. But the other kind, the kind that lived in you once you had been afraid for a while, once you had been afraid long enough that it had worn grooves, that kind had weight. It was heavy. It sat on your chest and behind your eyes, and it made everything slower and more distinct, the way really cold air made everything distinct. And if you had been trained at all, if someone had ever taken the time to put you at the edge of a birch forest with a rifle against your shoulder and explain the difference between a soldier and a hunter, you could use that weight. You could use it to stay very, very still. She was in the environmental control room with her back against the equipment rack when the door opened and the Djur-Kalith came in. She had not expected one here. The thermal mapping she had done suggested the northern sections were clear. But thermal mapping was imprecise, and the Djur-Kalith apparently ran cold, or ran at a different heat signature than the scans were calibrated for. And here one was. The largest she had seen inside the station, sensory cluster oriented toward the center of the room, moving with that rolling articulation of its 6 limbs. Marin did not move. The creature swept the room. The sensory cluster passed over her twice. She controlled her breathing with the discipline her mother had given her, shallow and regular and almost nothing, and she let the heavy fear do its work, and she stayed absolutely still, and the Djur-Kalith finished its survey and turned and walked back through the door. She let out a breath. Then she went to work on the atmospheric controls. Soot found her 20 minutes later. She was sitting on the floor with the access panel open beside her, running a bypass on the atmospheric scrubbers. "You're smiling," he said. He sounded like he found this concerning. "I found something useful in the controls. The station has a nitrogen purge protocol, emergency function. In the event of a hull breach in a specific section, the system can flood that section with inert gas to prevent atmospheric contamination from spreading." Soot stared at the panel. The Djur-Kalith breathe nitrogen. They breathe a nitrogen-oxygen mix, same as us. What they don't breathe is a nitrogen-rich mix that's about 40% denser than what they're used to. Their respiratory system is more volume-sensitive than ours. It's all in the environmental assessment. She looked up at him. Their biology, Arlen, they can be discouraged. He knelt down next to her. He looked at the wiring. "You know how to do this." "I know how to do roughly half of this. The other half I'm guessing." "That's less reassuring than you seem to think." "I know." She handed him a connector. "Hold this." They had 2 hours. They used them. Finn kept broadcasting. Caraway, one-armed and pale from blood loss, dragged himself to the secondary observation post and acted as an overwatch, providing whispered position updates over the local comm. Rosso and Park, moving through the eastern access tunnels with the careful efficiency of people who had accepted that they might die and decided to be useful about it anyway, herded the Djur-Kalith search groups through corridors that Marin had opened for them, guiding the aliens through the station in a slow loop that kept them away from the server room and the medical bay and the crawl space where Marin was finishing her wiring. She hummed while she worked, an old song, something her mother had sung while cleaning game. She could not have said why, it seemed right. She was on the final connection when Finn's voice came over the comm. I have a response on the emergency frequency. Every sound in the station seemed to drop away. IGDEF. A pause, unidentified, heavy encryption. Not a commercial signal. Whoever it is, they're close. Marin set down the wire cutters. She pressed the comm button. Can you get them? Already trying. A longer pause. Then Finn's voice came back, and there was something in it that Marin had not heard since before the wall came in. Something that was the opposite of the heavy fear. It's not IGDEF. It's sector response. It's one of them. One of them. Marin closed her eyes. One of the hunters. There were 6 hunters attached to the sector response force when it was first assembled, years ago, after the initial contact incidents. Nobody called them hunters officially. The official designation was something bureaucratic and forgettable. They were called hunters because that was what they were. Human beings who had been selected and trained and modified for a very specific purpose, which was to go places that conventional military units could not go and deal with problems that conventional military doctrine could not address. They were equipped in ways that made standard military hardware look like a first aid kit. They worked alone. Marin had never met one. She had read about them the same way she had read about the Djur-Kalith cultural assessments and the Vareka geological surveys and every other piece of documentation that had come through her terminal in the 9 weeks she had been at the station. Thoroughly, late at night, in the half hour before the cryo-drug hangover made reading impossible. She had read the mission profiles and the incident reports and the single available debrief from a hunter who had come back from the Kethsor incident, and she had thought, these are not soldiers. These are something else. The voice on the comm was flat, not robotic, not the way people who had never met soldiers expected soldiers to sound, but flat in the way that a very cold surface was flat. Functional, precise. Station Vareka, I have your signal, I'm 12 minutes out. What is your situation? Marin took the comm from Finn. 11 personnel, 3 wounded, 1 critical. Station breach from the western perimeter. Estimated 20 to 30 Djur-Kalith inside the structure. 1 confirmed casualty. A pause. Can you hold 12 minutes? She looked at the wiring. We can improve our odds in 12 minutes. Another pause, shorter. Do it. She finished the wiring with 7 minutes to spare. The nitrogen purge would not kill the Djur-Kalith. That was not the point. The point was that a nitrogen-heavy atmosphere in sections 1 through 4, the sections nearest the breach, would make those sections uncomfortable enough that the Djur-Kalith would withdraw from them. Not out of the station, not immediately, but into the central and eastern sections, away from the breach, which meant away from the direction the hunter would be coming from. She hoped. The thing about hunting, her mother had said, was that it was always a negotiation. You prepared everything you could prepare, and then you stepped outside the last door of your preparation and into the territory where things happened whether you were ready or not, and the difference between a good hunter and a dead one was not planning. It was the ability to read what was actually in front of you instead of what you had planned for. She checked the time, 4 minutes. Everyone in the secondary block, she said over the comm. Now, Finn, take the array offline and get moving. Caraway, you will accept assistance. That's an order. A silence, then Caraway's voice dry and pained and almost amused. Yes, sir. I'm not an officer. You're the closest thing we have. 4 minutes, Voss. The purge activated at 3:47. She heard the change in the station sound almost immediately. The Djur-Kalith moved differently through a degraded atmosphere. Slower. The rolling articulation of their limbs became something more labored. She could hear them through the walls, through the conduits, a change in the texture of the sounds the station was making, and she allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction before she pushed it away and focused. 3 minutes. 2. She was the last one into the secondary block. She pulled the door shut behind her. In the dim red emergency light, the faces of her people looked very clear, very defined, the way everything looked in very cold air. Caraway with his arms strapped to his chest. Finn with the bloodied hairline and the careful dark eyes. Rosso and Park pressed close together, not holding hands but almost. Soot, who met her gaze across the room and nodded once. She nodded back. 1 minute. The sound came from the western approach, a dense, percussive series of impacts that was not the sound of the Djurkalith. It was faster than the Djurkalith. Harder. Something moving through the station with the absolute clarity of purpose, hitting things that needed to be hit, not stopping. Then silence. Then the door to the secondary block opened. The hunter was not what she had pictured. The briefing files described them as large. The hunter who came through the door was large the way a storm system was large, not because of height or width, which were both significant, but because of the sense that here was something operating at a scale that included you, but was not primarily concerned with you. The armor was operational gray with a matte finish that caught the red emergency light strangely, as if the light had to negotiate with it. The helmet had the blank forward look of a face with nothing to prove. The hunter stopped in the doorway. The sensory sweep it performed on the room was fast and comprehensive. 7 survivors, it said. 7, Marin confirmed. A pause. The purge was your work. Yes. It was effective. I count 11 Djurkalith withdrawn to the junction section. That left me a clear western approach. Another pause. Something in the flat voice shifted by a fraction that she couldn't have named but felt distinctly. Good thinking. Marin had been awake for 22 hours on no food, and the adrenaline that had kept her upright was beginning to do its accounting, and she was suddenly, profoundly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She thought of her brother. She thought of her mother in the birch forest. She thought of the poem above her bunk that she would probably never read again, since the bunk and the poem were presumably both on the wrong side of the nitrogen purge right now. We have to get to the landing pad, she said. Through the junction section. Through the junction section. The hunter looked at her for a moment. Then it turned and looked back down the corridor it had come through, the corridor she had cleared, the corridor where 11 Djurkalith were now moving through a degraded atmosphere and would not be moving through it much longer because the purge had a 7-minute cycle, and the cycle was almost up. Stay close, the hunter said. I'm your best chance. They ran. It was not elegant, and it was not quiet, and it was not what the briefing said a tactical withdrawal should look like. It was 8 people moving as fast as a wounded man with one arm could move, through a station that had been systematically taken apart by something that worshipped the rock beneath it, following a figure in gray armor, who moved through the intersections ahead of them with the absolute decisiveness of something that had made its peace with all possible outcomes. The Djurkalith came out of Section 3 as they hit the junction corridor. 2 of them, moving faster than they had any right to move in the degraded atmosphere, sensory clusters oriented forward, limbs fully extended in what the briefing called an aggressive posture, and what Marin's body simply processed as run. She did not run. She stopped, she raised her rifle, she breathed. Her mother's voice, you have to get outside yourself. Think about what the other creature wants, where it's going, what it fears. The Djurkalith moved in a bilateral rush, both of them converging on the corridor mouth. They would expect flight. They would expect the 7 small soft creatures behind her to scatter, to create separation, to give the creatures the advantage of isolation. It was what everything soft and small did when something large and hard came at it. Marin did not scatter. She took the first one in the sensory cluster at a range of 8 meters, and the creature went down and stayed down, and then she moved to her right without looking, into the corridor alcove, and she let the second one commit to its line on where she had been, and she put 2 rounds into its midsection as it passed the alcove entrance, and it went down with a sound she would hear for a long time. Soot was beside her. He was breathing hard. He said, "I thought we were running." "We are," Marin said. "Keep going." They lost Rosso in the outer corridor. Not to the Djurkalith, to the edge of the space elevator dock, which had partially collapsed when the Djurkalith first breached the station, and which gave way under him in the dark without warning. Marin heard his sound and turned, and Park was already at the edge, reaching, and she pulled Park back because the drop was 7 meters onto exposed conduit, and Rosso was already still. Park did not make a sound. Park pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, exactly the way Marin had done when she came out of cryo, that privacy, and then she took her hand away, and she was still a person with a rifle, and she moved. They all moved. The hunter was at the western exterior door when they reached it. The lock was intact. The hunter looked at it for a moment and then hit it with a closed fist in a specific location, and the door opened. The night air of the Verica rock came in, thin and cold and smelling of mineral dust and something else, something the atmospheric sensors had never adequately characterized, something that Marin had come to associate over 9 weeks with the particular loneliness of a place where humans had no business being. The landing pad was 150 meters across the rock shelf. The Djurkalith were behind them. "Move," the hunter said. It turned and positioned itself at the door, and the meaning of that was clear, and Marin moved. She was 60 meters across the rock shelf when the sounds of the engagement behind her made the thin, cold air ring. The hunter was not a subtle fighter. The hunter engaged the way a geological event engaged, with the sense that whatever was happening at a level of force that had decided most of the question in advance. She heard the sounds and did not look back because her mother had also said, "When you're running, run." Soot reached the pad first. He was 19 and his legs worked better than anyone else's at that moment, and he had the sense to look for the ship rather than stop and wait, and he found it because IGDEF ships made certain noises, and he had been listening to those noises for 6 months. He turned on the landing lights, which was the right decision, because the pad edge was poorly marked, and in the dark 2 of them would have gone off it. Caraway came in second. Then Fen, with her arm around Park. Both of them bent forward against the thin wind coming off the rock. Then Marin. She stopped at the edge of the pad and turned. The hunter was still at the door, 70 meters back. The Djurkalith that were pursuing them had pulled back and regrouped, and were now arranged at the door in a way that looked, even at distance, even in the dark, like something that had come to a decision. There were a lot of them. Marin raised her rifle. She did math. She had 11 rounds. The distance was 70 meters uphill. She was exhausted and her hands were shaking, and the hunter was at the door and the ship was behind her, and the smart thing was to get on the ship. She had never been only a soldier. She put the first 3 rounds into the edge of the group at the door, and the Djurkalith closest to the hunter pulled back from the shots, and that was enough of a gap. The hunter came through the gap at a run, moving across the rock shelf with the ground-eating stride of something that had decided everything it needed to decide, and it crossed the 70 meters in the time it took Marin to fire 4 more rounds into the regrouping mass behind it. When the hunter reached the pad, it didn't slow down. It moved past her toward the ship, and she heard its voice. Now. She ran. The ship lifted at 412. Through the viewport she could see the Verica rock getting small. The station lights, most of them still on, the ones the Djurkalith hadn't touched. The breach in the western wall visible even from altitude, a dark gap in the pressurized box that humans had bolted to a sacred stone without understanding that it was sacred. She wondered briefly, What happened next? Whether Command sent someone. Whether the rock got returned to the Jur-Caliph or whether Command decided that IGDEF held the position and sent more humans to bolt more boxes to more stones. She thought it would probably be the second one. She turned away from the viewport. The main bay of the ship was small. They were packed in it, 6 of them, in various states of damage, in the particular silence of people who have just come through something together and have not yet figured out what the coming through means. Caraway was unconscious, which was probably better for his collarbone. Finn had gotten a bandage on her forehead. Park was sitting with her back against the hull and her knees drawn up and her eyes open, looking at nothing specifically. Soot was sitting across from Marin. He was very still. The easy smile was gone, replaced by something that was not sadness exactly and was not hardness exactly, but was the face you got on the other side of a certain threshold. She recognized it because she had seen it in a mirror once, a long time ago, after something she did not think about directly. He reached into his uniform pocket. He took out a small, folded photograph. He looked at it for a moment and then held it out to her. It was a barbecue restaurant. An outside sign, hand-painted with a pig on it that had been drawn by someone who had thought about pigs but never seen one up close. A parking lot. Summer light. She looked at it for a long moment. Rosso would have hated it, Soot said. He was from Sacramento, very particular about food. Sounds like him. He would have complained the whole time. A pause. He would have eaten everything. Marin handed the photograph back. She did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Soot folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket, and that was enough. The hunter came out of the cockpit when they were about an hour out. It sat across from her, in the jump seat against the starboard hull, and it removed the helmet and she saw a face that was ordinary in the specific way that extraordinary things were sometimes ordinary. Angular and tired and carrying something behind the eyes that she could not categorize. A depth of accumulated consequence that she recognized as the feeling of moving through the world for a long time, with the specific weight that came from understanding what the world cost. "You'll be at Herschel Station in 14 hours, the hunter said. "Medical triage is already notified. They'll take Caraway first." Marin nodded. "Your nitrogen purge gave me a clear approach. I want you to understand that. Without it, I would have come in through the eastern sections, and the Jur-Caliph would have had a corridor." She looked at the hunter. "I want you to understand something," she said. A slight tilt of the head. "Attention. We lost someone, Rosso. He fell in the dock when we were running. We couldn't," she stopped, breathed. "He's still in there." The hunter was quiet for a moment. "I know. I want to go back." "I know. Then why aren't we?" "Because the Jur-Caliph will close the station within the next 2 hours, and there will be no entering it again by any means available to us. Because going back at this moment means losing everyone on this ship. Because Private Rosso was already dead when he fell." The hunter's voice was flat, but it was not cold. There was a difference that she heard clearly. Sometimes the mission is to bring back who you can. Marin pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She sat with that for a long time. "I need to be better at this," she said finally. The hunter looked at her. Something shifted in the face. "No," it said. "You were good at this. Being good at this and losing people are not separate categories. They're the same category." She stared at the hull. She was so tired. "You hummed," the hunter said. She looked up. "When you were working on the atmospheric controls, I could hear it on the comm, faint. You hummed something." She hadn't known anyone was listening. She hadn't known there was anyone to listen to. She thought about it. An old song. "Something my mother sang." "She taught you to hunt." It was not a question. She thought about the birch forest, the snow in her boots, the specific quality of winter morning light on snow so clean it almost hurt, how small she had been, how clear everything had seemed. "Yes," Marin said. The hunter nodded, reached into a compartment behind the jump seat and produced a ration pack, which was a very unromantic thing to do after a conversation like that, and set it on the seat beside her. Eat. You've been running on nothing for 7 hours. She looked at the ration pack. She picked it up. What do they call you? She said. Your actual name. The hunter was quiet for a moment, not refusing, considering. Kale, it said. Marin. She tore the ration pack open with her teeth. I'm going to request a secondment to sector response when we reach Herschel. The hunter, Kale, looked at her with the eyes that carried depth of accumulated consequence. I know, it said. At Herschel Station, 14 hours later, in the medical bay while a doctor she did not know reset Caraway's collarbone, and Fenn finally got the gash above her hairline properly closed, and Park sat with her knees drawn up in a chair by the door with the specific stillness of someone who was going to be all right eventually, but was not all right yet. Marin sat at a terminal in the intake corridor and filed her request. She put it in under Sector Response, Field Application, Hunter Division. The intake form asked her to describe her relevant qualifications. She wrote, I know the difference between a soldier and a hunter. My mother taught me. I think that's what you need. She sent it. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, thought about Rosso and the way he would have complained about the barbecue while eating everything, thought about Private Chen, who she had not stopped to mourn because the mission required not stopping. She stopped now. She gave them a few minutes. They deserved that. Then she thought about the poem above her bunk. She could remember enough of it. Something about the tide and the stars and forward motion, and how the word dawn did not promise anything gentle, it promised light. It promised you could finally see what was in front of you. She thought that was probably enough. 3 weeks later, a message came back from Sector Response. She was sitting in the Herschel Station commissary with Soot, who had recovered the easy smile but worn it differently now, who had started asking more questions during briefings and listening to the answers more carefully, who was going to be, she thought, something useful to the world if the world gave him the time. She read the message twice. What is it? Soot said. She set the comm down on the tray. She looked at him. She thought about the birch forest and the rifle and the particular sound the thing ahead of you made in the underbrush when it realized you had gotten there first. New assignment, she said. He waited. Sector Response. She picked up her fork. I start in 2 weeks. Soot was quiet. He looked at his food, then he looked at her. You're going to be one of them. She considered that. I'm going to be myself, she said. That's been enough so far. Soot nodded slowly. He had the look of someone filing something important into a place where he'd be able to find it later. Rosso would have had something to say about that, he said. He would have. Something about how you think too much. Probably. He would have been wrong. Marin smiled. It was small and it cost something and she didn't hide it. Yeah, she said, he would have been. She picked up her coffee cup. Outside the commissary viewport, the Herschel Station docking ring was moving through its rotation cycle, and beyond it the black, and in the black the stars were very clear, and somewhere in that clarity, 11 months away by cryo, or 14 hours in a sector response cutter, there was a rock that humans had decided to bolt things to, and on that rock there was a station that would be a Djurkalith site in another few years. And under the debris of that station, there was a young man from Sacramento who had never seen a pig up close. She looked at the stars for a moment. Then she looked forward. There was work to do.